say I am not Manuel Balmaceda. Manuel is trapped somewhere in Spain, unable to get into the country for reasons that are above my rank, obviously, but I'm going to do my best to fill in them, and you will hear from Manuel at various times virtually throughout the conference. On my part, I will offer a proper introduction tomorrow at lunch, but for now, welcome. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here early. I want to remind you, I have one job, and that one job is to remind you that if you do not have the NABE Connect app, this would be a wonderful time to download it because that's how we will handle questions that you might want to ask of any of our speakers throughout the conference. And I'm assured that you have received emails that have all of the appropriate login information. And if you are like me and lost your emails long ago, they've passed anything that came in about 3 minutes ago, the folks outside will help you. So with that, let's get started. Holly.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to see everyone in person, and hello to everybody who is virtual sitting on their couch still. We are starting the conference with economic forecasting, certainly a daunting profession for the most predictable of times, but we are now in a pandemic. Speaking of forecasting though, I just wanted to plug NABE's own Outlook survey will be released tonight, or technically tomorrow morning at 12:01 Eastern Standard Time. So for those in more accommodating time zones or have insomnia, check it out when it is released. Very interesting data looking forward and covering 2021, 2022 as far as economic forecasting. But our first presenter, we're thrilled to have Prakash Loungani. He is the Assistant Director in the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office. He is co-author of Confronting Inequality, How Societies Can Choose Inclusive Growth. Previously, he headed the Development Macroeconomics Division at the IMF's Research Department and was co-chair of the IMF's Jobs and Growth Working Group from 2011 to 2015. He's an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and the University of Maryland and a member of the Steckler Research Program in Forecasting at George Washington University. And his topic today is herd immunity, the first shot at analyzing private sector forecasts during COVID-19. No small feat. I did preview his slide deck and there are cartoons. So this is wonderful information that we're gonna get. With that very impressive bio, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Holly. Thanks to NABE for this invitation to present some of my work on trying to look at how forecasters did during this period. So this is joint work with a number of brilliant young people, Zidong An, Umberto Colladel, and Martin McCarthy. So what we do in this work that's ongoing is to look at how well consensus forecasts did in predicting how the economy would do over 2021. We compare the evolution of forecasts with previous recessions, and we also compare the consensus, which we take as being sort of the voice of the private sector, even though it has a few public sector forecasts, it's largely private. So we compare sort of the voice of the private sector with that of the public sector, in this case, represented by the IMF. What we do not do in this presentation is to offer an assessment of the IMF's forecasting performance. That's something that's ongoing. I'm actually leading an evaluation of the IMF's response to the pandemic, as part of which we will be looking at IMF forecasts. So I don't want to front run my own investigation. So I will not speculate on how or why the IMF did what it did, but you folks are free to. So please, if you're inclined to speculate about the IMF's performance, we would love to have your reactions for our evaluation. So here are some findings from the literature prior to the pandemic that may be useful for thinking about the IMF's and the consensus performance. The first finding from the literature is that in the past, there has been no overshooting. Namely, the forecasts have not crossed the actual and then backtracked. There has always been a smooth adjustment of forecasts towards the eventual outcome during a recession year. So forecasts eventually catch up with reality. By the end of the year, we all get it right. We can with great confidence say what happened during that year in our forecasts. But throughout the year, we are kind of adjusting, shifting, but we don't go out and make bold forecasts and overshoot the actual outcome. The second finding from the literature is that even though private and public sector forecasters, you might think, have very different incentives and processes and outcome and goals in mind, they actually end up hurting. They kind of mirror one another. So in this case, I'll show you that IMF and consensus forecasts are virtually identical, have been virtually identical in the past. And even within consensus, the group of private sector forecasters, in the past, at least, you have not seen huge divergence. It's not as though one guy says, +4 and the other guy says -10. That's been a kind of a rare occurrence. So the main findings of this presentation are going to be that during the pandemic, we saw something completely different, okay? In the past, we had no overshooting. This time, you will see that both the private sector and the IMF overshot the outcome, and they then backtracked. In the past, as I said, very little daylight between consensus and IMF. This time, you will see some gaps between the two. So let's review the pre-pandemic findings. So we'll be focusing on what happens to forecast during recession years. I won't talk about the other kind of the normal times. So the first thing to keep in mind is that a recession is not a black swan event. It happens quite a lot. It happens about 15% of the time over any reasonable sample period. So forecasters should be having recessions on their mind quite a bit. They should be thinking about, is it going to happen? Is it not? If it's going to happen, what do I know about the past recessions? How should I be adjusting my forecast? It's not like something that's not an asteroid event that hits you out of the blue and you say, oh my God, a recession, I don't know what to do. It's happened 15% of the time, okay? So what we've done is to assemble a data set of consensus and IMF forecasts from 1990 to the present. So we have 30 good years in this sample. We have a very simple definition of a recession or a crisis. If GDP fell that year, that was a recession. And that gives us 159 recession episodes for consensus and 436 recession episodes for the IMF. The IMF provides forecasts for many more countries than the consensus, so it's a bigger sample. Now, what we have found is that in the past, there have been departures from efficient forecasts, okay? So forecasters are trying to predict the same event, annual real GDP growth. Every month in consensus, they have an opportunity to revise the forecast, okay? And what we find is that these forecast revisions are extremely smooth. And your first reaction would be, oh, that makes sense. That's how I would do it. I would make small changes. I wouldn't go overboard and change it by 5% 1 year and then 1 month and then change it back. But if you think about it from the perspective of an efficient forecast, That's not an efficient forecast. If I can look at your forecast, as Nordhaus, the Nobel Prize winning economist, says, if I can look at your forecast and predict what you're going to do the next month, that's not an efficient forecast. Okay? That may be a story you want to tell your client for many purposes, but don't call it a forecast. Okay? So efficient forecasts, if you really are reflecting the information that you're getting month by month, minute by minute in your forecast, should be jagged. They should be all over the place. Okay? You should be like saying, remember, this is a recession year. A lot of information is coming in from all sources of all kinds. You should be like going crazy saying, oh, everything's going to hell. Oh no, it's getting a little better. Oh no, it is going to hell. So you should be like all over the map. And what you'll see is that people, all of us in this room who make forecasts professionally are not all over the map. We are like, oh, it looks bad, but I'll adjust my forecast a little bit. Oh, it's really getting bad. I really should make a big change, but now I'll make a small change, okay? So this is what the typical pattern of a forecast looks like. This is a very specific example. Brazil in 2015 had a recession. So you're looking at what forecasters were thinking in 2014. In 2014, they didn't have a clue. You don't blame them. You know, who knows why recessions happen. We're not very good at forecasting them in advance. We're only looking at the behavior once you know something bad is happening. So at this point, at this point, people know that something bad is happening in Brazil. So they've already marked down their forecast. And look at the changes over the course of 2015, the year of the recession. Little by little, by little, by little, by little, you mark down. And this is the outcome. And you never actually hit the outcome, okay? This is consensus, this is IMF, same behavior. IMF doesn't forecast as often, but you see the same behavior. And in the slides that are going to come up, what I want you to see is that during the pandemic, what was different is this arrow, which shows the adjustment of forecast, actually crossed the outcome, okay? That is the big difference this time. So pay attention to what this arrow looks like when I show the slides for this, for the pandemic. And now I'm just going to literally rush through these slides because they all tell you the same story and convince you that this is what happens. So this is consensus forecast for advanced economies, 69 recessions. Smooth adjustment doesn't cross the outcome. This is consensus forecast for emerging market economies. Average of 90 recessions, smooth adjustment doesn't cross the outcome. This is the IMF, same story. Okay. Now, why do we have such cowardice? You know, why is it that we kind of make these small adjustments? One story you may tell, and it could be true in some cases, is that the bad news just came in little drips and drabs and you kept adjusting your forecast smoothly. It's possible in some cases, it's unlikely that in every single case, the information came in small doses, okay? So the other story that from talking to forecasters you hear is that they say, oh, it'll freak out our clients if we just move our forecast all over the map. They'll say like, you don't know what you're doing, okay? That may be true. You may have a reason for shielding your clients from the truth, but that's not a forecast, okay? That's a story that you're telling. And sometimes people say that, you know, we didn't want to change the baseline forecast, but we told our customers or client, look, my gut feeling is things are getting really bad. So through your text or through your verbal communications with them, you said, oh, I know I'm not changing my forecast, but I'm telling you things are bad. Okay. So there are lots of reasons. I think over 20 years of studying these forecasts, I've come to the conclusion, at least for me, is that a lot of behavioral reasons, and it was emphasized by Nordhaus, is that we tend to break the bad news to ourselves slowly, taking too long to allow surprises to be incorporated into our forecasts, okay? It's the triumph of hope over experience, as shown in this slide. The other fact, as I mentioned, is that consensus and IMF forecasts are virtually on top of each other, okay? So this is, you can't see the details, I realize, but on one axis you have the IMF forecast, on the other axis you have the consensus. If you can't tell which axis is which, that's my point, okay? This is a 45-degree line, and there are very few deviations from the 45-degree line. The correlation is almost 0.95 or higher. Okay. Now let's get to what happened during the pandemic. What happened during the pandemic is that both these things were overturned. So again, we are just looking at annual real GDP growth. Our data set consists of consensus forecasts made during 2020, IMF, and the World Bank's global economic forecast. Some of these results will be in the additional slides. I won't have time to cover them. Okay. So here's the arrows, right? Previously, what you saw was you just needed one arrow to describe the evolution of forecasts. Now you see that is no longer the case. So what are you looking at here? You're looking at, first of all, the actual, the outcome as best we know it as of now. These are forecasts for the United States. You're looking at two dots, the blue for consensus and the orange for real. So this is January 2020. You can see the forecasts are on top of each other as they were historically, okay? And then you can see that consensus starts to think something is going wrong. They start to revise their forecast down a little bit. And then huge dip in April. IMF also revises its forecast, becomes more pessimistic than the consensus, okay? By June, they are again both more pessimistic. They keep overshooting the outcome, which, as I told you, is a complete rarity in my history of studying these forecasts. And then they backtrack towards the outcomes, okay? This is Brazil, same story. You need two arrows to describe what happened rather than the one in the past. This looks at global growth, again, giving you the same story. And now I'm focusing on the fact that there was this difference in herding. Previously, private and public sector were at the same place. Now you can see that there are gaps between the IMF and the consensus. The IMF is noticeably more pessimistic for its global growth forecasts and for the US and Brazil that you saw previously. Same story for advanced economies, same story for emerging markets, okay? And if you say, well, you know, look, I love all countries, but you know, it's the big ones that matter for global growth. Here are the top 10 countries, top 10 in the sense that they receive the biggest weight in the IMF's growth forecast. And what you see is that you get a very similar pattern across the two. So whenever the consensus was optimistic, IMF was 2. There are only 2 such cases in the top 10, India and Indonesia. The UK, you can see there's a divergence between the consensus and the IMF. But in the other 7 cases, the IMF and the consensus were pessimistic, were both pessimistic. Now the scale is a bit different. So you did see that the IMF was on average more pessimistic than consensus, and that is shown here as well because this scale is from negative 2.5 to 2.5, and this scale goes up all the way to 4, so indicating pessimism. So they were making the same errors, if you will, but the IMF was kind of more pessimistic in all these cases. So for the United States, the IMF was more pessimistic in June than the consensus. Okay. I also said that this time there was a lot of deviation within consensus itself. So this gives you the standard deviation of consensus forecast, because what we've been talking about so far is kind of the mean forecast, but consensus also reports each individual forecast, you know, and so you can see what the dispersion, the standard deviation was within those forecasts. And what you see is that there was a tremendous increase in the dispersion of forecasts going up to 1.5 percentage, over 1.5 percentage points, and then very slowly dissipated over the course of 2020. And if you will look at individual countries, you sort of get the same pattern, a big increase in uncertainty within forecasters on what was about to happen. And I've given you some statistics in that box there to give you some perspective. So, what does 2 standard deviation mean? That may not resonate with you right away. So what it means is that in April 2020, the most optimistic US forecast was minus 1.3%. The most pessimistic was minus 8.5. In June, the similar numbers were about minus 3 and minus 9.5. Okay. So there was clearly a lot of uncertainty, and there was a getting away from herding because people didn't know which way things were going to go. Okay. And to give you perspective, during the global financial crisis, the same standard deviation was about 0.7, 0.9. So clearly during the pandemic, there was much greater uncertainty within the people constituting the consensus, nearly twice as much in terms of the standard deviation on which way things would go. Let me skip that. So quick word about the magnitude of forecast errors. So in 2020 mid-year, the average error was about 3 percentage points. If you compare that with the past recessions, it was 1.5 percentage points. So in an absolute sense, errors were higher. A natural question is, what do you scale this by? Do you scale it by the extent of the shock? If you do, then 2020 looks pretty good because of a much bigger shock this time than in terms of the drop in GDP than the global financial crisis. Was it much more difficult to forecast? In the past, yes, we've failed to anticipate recessions, but when they've happened, they've been on our home turf. There have been banking crises, there have been currency crises, debt crises. It's been on our home turf, and we know something about those crises. This time, it's a pandemic. And all of us are learning on the fly about, how to think about how a pandemic might evolve and what impact it might have on the economy. So, it's an open question. Is a drop in GDP a good measure of the shock or some measure of the uncertainty? And in the additional slides, I've provided some evidence that uncertainty was greater during the pandemic than what we've faced in the past. For EMs, actually, the performance was better in absolute terms than in the past. Okay. So let me stop here with the summary. If you had to walk out and somebody asked you, what did you hear? That's the takeaway. The 2020 forecasting episode marked a departure from the forecasting behavior we have seen during the pandemic. There was less smoothing, which I think is a good thing. There was way too much smoothing and reluctance to face the truth in the past. I think that through necessity or luck went away, and there was less herding. So consensus and IMF forecasts overshot the outcome. I think that was a good thing. We should be overshooting the outcome much more than we have in the past. And there was less herding. There were gaps between the IMF and the consensus, which I also think is a good thing. We shouldn't be too aware of each other's forecasts and saying, oh, we better stick to each other. Otherwise, we'll have to answer questions of why we are departing. So I think from my perspective, my personal perspective, everything that happened from a forecasting perspective over the last year, it was a disaster, and of course, in many ways. But from a forecasting behavior and from my perspective, there were some good things that came out of it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I forgot to mention at the beginning that if you have a question, to submit your question in the app, and I will make sure to refresh. I don't know if there's a microphone, if you would rather just raise your hand and ask a question. I think we can accommodate that too. But I'll start off with a question. In going through the exercise of looking at forecasting with consensus in the IMF during a pandemic, was there anything that surprised you as far as what you expected and then what you found out subsequently?
I think I was pleasantly surprised at the willingness to think the unthinkable. I think that in the past, there has been a reluctance on the past of forecasters to really say, I'm getting very bad news, I should really revise my forecast. And I don't mean to be judgmental. I was forecasting the Asian crisis at the IMF, way back in 1997, 98, and I was responsible for forecasting Korea. And Korea had been growing at 7%, the last 20 years. And during the crisis, I marked down my forecast to plus 3%. And everybody in the room is like, are you crazy? I mean, there's no connection between what you told us is going on and why you're at 3%. But in my mind, the 7% was like an anchoring thing. To me, I went from 7 to plus 3. That was like a big change. And I just couldn't contemplate, going down to where, way negative territory. So I think what was really reassuring to me is that I'm not at liberty to reveal the individual forecast within consensus, but when I studied some of the forecasters, there was clearly early recognition that this was going to be a bad time, and early recognition on the part of many forecasters within consensus, some of whom may be in this room, to go deeply negative. And I think reassuringly also willingness on the part of my own institution, the IMF, to say, look, things could be really bad, and actually to go past where the outcome has ended up, to me, was actually very reassuring.
When you were talking about some of the ways in which news gets infiltrated in folks forecasting, but also the story and having to be consistent, how, I guess, hopeful in your case are you that the uncertainty or the level of certainty that we're going through now will carry forward in forecasting, and folks will feel more comfortable in living in the uncertainty and looking at ranges of prospects?
I think 2021, when you actually look at measures of uncertainty that can be quantified, and I think uncertainty is very difficult to quantify, so I don't honestly know whether you folks are feeling that I have a better handle of what's going on than I did in 2020, but to the extent that I, as an external observer, can look at quantifiable measures of uncertainty, they have gone down considerably. So, and it's there in the additional slides that I have up in my presentation. So from that perspective, I would think that forecasters are in a better terrain right now. Things are, yes, we all worry about the next variant and the next variant and the impact it would have. But as far as I can quantify it, things have really actually gotten better in terms of a more even forecasting terrain. So I would hope that the 2021 forecast, when I finish studying them in a couple of months, will look better than what the 2020 forecast did. And I would say that forecasters were actually right in most forecasters in consensus predicted a V-shaped recovery. So they felt that 2020 would be bad, but they predicted a 2021 recovery. Now, to some extent, this is just a kind of a smart money call. Most recessions last 1 year. So I've been studying this for a long time. I noticed that whenever there's a recession, forecasters mark down the year of the recession and they always predict a recovery the following year. And that's the smart money call. 70% of recessions last 1 year. So if you didn't know any better, you should call for a recovery the next year. And that's what forecasters did in this case. And they're turning out to be right. And I think the uncertainty, as you asked me is going in the right direction. Uncertainty is coming down, and it looks like the 2021 forecast would end up being pretty good.
With the minute that we have left, a question that came in, do you believe the increased use of high frequency data improved or worsened GDP forecast?
It's not something that I've studied for 2020, but it's something that I have studied in the past. And at least from my research, the answer sadly is no. It's not as though having more and regular and high frequency information has changed. It's a question that has come up for me in the past because I've been studying these things for 20, 30 years. And there is no marked improvement either in the ability to forecast recessions, which remains basically non-existent. 30 years ago, I said that the inability to forecast recessions is virtually unblemished. And I think that conclusion remains unchallenged. So over time, the fact that we have all these real-time data and so on, sadly, I think has not made a dent in the ability to forecast recessions, which is why I stress the behavioral explanations. I think there's something in us that just doesn't allow us to, mark our forecast down extremely, then raise them, then kind of have a bouncy forecast is just something that doesn't resonate with us, even the ones that understand that efficient forecast should actually mean that we let our forecast go up and down a lot.
Great. Well, thank you so much for offering your insights on this.
Thank you all very much.
I know. No pressure. Okay. All right, we're good. We're good? Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. We'll get started. Welcome to the session Global Health and Economic Update amid COVID-19. I'm Pia Orrenius, Vice President and Senior Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas and member of the NABE Board. And it's my honor to moderate this session, this hybrid session. Hopefully the technology will work out. I'll briefly introduce the speakers, but of course you have bios in your programs or on your app, so you should look there for more detail. But after I introduce them, I'll turn it over to them to explain what they do and sort of give an opening remarks and an overview of their respective topics on this session. And then we'll move to questions and answers. So we have two amazing panelists. So Dr. Jeff Gold, I can't see him, not sure where he's supposed to be, but he should be on here. So Dr. Jeff Gold is Chancellor of the University of Nebraska Medical Center, Vice President of the University of Nebraska System, and Chair of the Board of the Nebraska Medicine Health System since 2014. In July of 2021, as if he didn't have enough on his plate, Dr. Gold was also named Provost and Executive Vice President of the University of Nebraska System. I'm also going to let him explain more about what his center does because it's so broad and encompassing and different from anything that sort of we're familiar with at NABE. So he's going to do a little bit of an overview about what his center does and explain that to you before he gives his overview about the COVID pandemic. Then, of course, we have Greg. Greg, I should have asked you, is it Daco or Daco? Daco, awesome. So he's Chief U.S. Economist at Oxford Economics, and you probably recognize him. If you've been around NABE, you would know Greg because he's a former member of the board. But of course, you may have heard him on NPR or seen him on CNBC, BBC, or Bloomberg TV. And prior to joining Oxford Economics, Greg was Director of US Macroeconomics at IHS Global Insight. So Dr. Gold, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off. And I thought you'd start first, describe a little better what your center does for everyone, and then give your overview, if that sounds okay.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you, albeit virtually today. I am very much looking forward to sharing some thoughts and, of course, answering your questions. There are a number of things that I do want to touch on. I, of course, want to give a little bit of a background about the University of Nebraska Global Center for Health Security, as Pia said during the introduction. And then we'll talk a little bit about setting the global stage for the rest of your meeting together. A concept that we've studied known as 63 days, and then a bit about some of the public-private partnership health security hubs that are currently under development. I have two disclaimers. One is that I have no conflict of interest. And secondly, the only thing we know for 100% assurance about this COVID pandemic is that it will definitely not be the last. So for those of you that may not be familiar, the University of Nebraska is the university system for the state of Nebraska, smack dab in the middle of the nation. And one of our centers of excellence is the Global Center for Health Security. The Global Center for Health Security, or as we refer to it as the GCHS, is a resource that focuses not on policy, but on clinical care, operations, research, training, and education. So unlike many of the health security think tanks and policy centers around the world, we are focused specifically around chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, environmental threats, mitigation, response, and dealing with some of the clinical care and operations that come from it. So looking specifically at the biohazards and at the response to all things COVID, we have been involved since the very beginning of this pandemic, meaning going back to the very, very beginning of January 2020, with the basic pathophysiology of the virus, patterns of transmission, bioinformatics of the sequencing, surveillance, quarantine, isolation. We're the only US federal quarantine and isolation unit, biocontainment, the development of new diagnostic, treatment, and vaccines, clinical trials, data analytics, mobile apps, advising, communications, logistics, operations, training, simulation. And we are a known and trusted liaison to multiple federal departments and agencies. When I say multiple, I include those key relationships with the Department of Health and Human Services, specifically ASPR, CDC, NDMS, and FDA, if you'll excuse the alphabet soup of those relationships, with the Department of Defense of the United States government, specifically the Joint Chiefs, the Defense Health Agency, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and US Stratcom, which is less than 10 miles from where I'm speaking to you from. And then, of course, with the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Veterans Administration, and others. So we have just dozens and dozens of these training, education, treatment, and care relationships, such that we, for instance, cared for Ebola patients in 2014 and 2015, have trained tens of thousands, almost 100,000 NDMS workers in the areas of biocontainment. We repatriated citizens from Wuhan City. We accepted all of the infected American citizens off the Diamond Princess cruise ship, and on and on. So there's quite a bit here. And, please understand that I'm a recovering cardiac surgeon. I am not a virologist, but you'd be amazed what a dumb surgeon can learn in a few years about a virus. So that's us. So let's set the global stage for just a minute. 230 million or plus confirmed cases and 4.7 million confirmed deaths. Of course, these are underestimates, but we are currently recording somewhere around 500,000 new cases per day. I believe if we had accurate determination, particularly in the developing world, these numbers would be at least 50% higher, if not 100% higher, as would the death rates. If you look at the last 90 days, I think it really tells a very important story, in that while we are clearly not quite as high globally as we were in this fourth surge of the pandemic in mid-August, we are pretty much in a plateau stage, although we have ups and downs dependent upon reporting, availability of testing, and things of that nature. We certainly cannot say that the pandemic's in the rearview mirror. If you look at the US rates, they are stunning as well. We are at a stage now that approximately 1 out of every 7 Americans has been confirmed to have had COVID, and 1 out of every 500 approximately has died from it. The COVID deaths, the confirmed COVID deaths in the United States have exceeded both world wars, the American Civil War, and tragically, a week ago Monday, the deaths estimated from the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And by the way, we are not done. So, let's wind the clock back to 2017, 2018, and 2019, when the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine convened at the request of the Department of Defense and the Department of Health and Human Services, a workshop that focused on the public-private sector. Don Berwick and Ken Shine were the conveners. And these were the concluding remarks of the written documents that were published amazingly in February of 2020, written in the fall, that, quote, not since the threat of global nuclear war first emerged has humankind faced the risks of potential disasters at the scale that 21st century threats bring. Little did they know that by the time this ink had dried on the published version of the Journal of the American Medical Association, we would be well into the earliest stages of this pandemic. They close with this statement in that, however, at this point, the US healthcare system is wholly unprepared for a wide range of 21st century health threats. They conclude as well that it lacks the will, coordinative mechanisms, habits of cooperation, governance agreements, and shared resource investments essential to the preparedness. Now, we entertained a study here, our Global Center for Health Security and our public health people, which we titled 63 Days. And it was aimed at looking at the first 63 days of this pandemic, counting as day one when the first American was actually hospitalized. So that 63 days started on January 23rd, 2020, and ended on March 27th. During that 63-day period, 10,000 individuals in the United States were hospitalized, 197,000 cases, 76,000 deaths spread over 1,500 hospitals at a loss of our healthcare system, non-recoverable, of $50 billion. But on day 63, the US GDP was estimated to be down over 32%. The debt was up. The US employment was down 15.9 million, and the Dow and the S&P were both down over 30%. Indeed, the map of the United States was rapidly turning red. These 63 days turned out to be the most critical time in the pandemic. And why did we choose 63 days? Because that's when we got to 10,000 hospitalizations. Or to put it differently, if we had 10 hospital systems in the United States that could each have absorbed 1,000 cases, what might have been different? So in order to answer that question, we compared our outcome for the first year to the outcome of Japan and South Korea. So what you see in the upper table here over these 365 days from February 2020 to February 2021, the outcomes in cases and in deaths per million population. I want to underscore per million population. So in the first year, we had just over 84,000 confirmed cases, again, an underestimate. And we had over 1,400 confirmed deaths per million population. Of course, we are well beyond those numbers now. But during that same period of time in Japan, they had 3,200 confirmed cases, or 3.8%. And they had 53, that's 53 confirmed deaths, or 3.6% per million population. In South Korea, they had 1,600 confirmed cases per million population and 29 deaths. So to put it differently, in the lower panel, if in the United States had the Japanese response, we would have, instead of having 28 million confirmed cases, we would have had just over 1 million confirmed cases. If we had the South Korean response, we would have had about half of that, or 536,000 total confirmed cases. And if you look at the death toll, in the first year, we had 486,000 confirmed deaths. If we had the Japanese system in place, writ large, it would have been approximately 17,600, and the South Korean response, 9,600. So the question, of course, has to be asked, what is the difference? And what lessons can and should be learned from these differences? And of course, there are major differences in culture, in governance, in economics, and you folks are far more knowledgeable about that than I. But what we are particularly knowledgeable about is their pandemic response systems. And indeed, they have what are technically referred to as health security centers. These are inpatient and outpatient centers capable of developing and training workforce, supplies, diagnostic care, screening, research dedicated for both basic and clinical trials. They are involved with both domestic and international outreach. They're partnered with us in many different ways. These centers handle both their military and their civilian needs, as well as a full spectrum of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and environmental explosive care. That is to say, they're not unique to pandemics and infectious diseases. And they have formed an outreach network. And there are several other parts of the world that have similar systems, including Israel, Singapore. But these two countries, because of their extremely sophisticated data systems, allow for the comparison of outcomes. So we are working very closely with our federal partners through the Global Center for Health Security to identify at least 5 and hopefully 10, one in each of the Health and Human Services designated regions of the United States, to attempt to identify opportunities for public-private partnerships to mimic these types of all-hazard patient care, research, and medical education. The idea, of course, being that no matter what would happen with the tail's end of this pandemic, whenever that occurs, but when the next pandemic from infectious disease, chemical event, nuclear event, et cetera, happens here globally, infecting our military or our civilians, we have a system in place tied closely to our global partners to be able to respond in a much more time-effective way, so we could have those first critical months to prepare, develop antivirals or anti-radiation medication, vaccines, policy, communications, and other such things, so that we do not ever need to go down this road again. So Pia, I will stop at this point. Thank you for the opportunity and look forward to being able to answer questions and engage in discussion. So thank you.
Greg, we'll turn it over to you for the economic implications.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back in person. I think the last conference I was at was the NABE Policy Conference a year and a half ago. So it's great to be back with you all. And what I wanted to do is kind of rebound on some of what's been discussed so far in terms of the economic outlook, some of the forecasting, some of the health matters that we've been discussing so far this. In terms of our view for the global outlook, we continue to have a fairly constructive view for the outlook for next year. It's going to be somewhat slower than what we've seen so far. So we think we're past peak growth, but we are not in an environment where the economy, the global economy, is about to go into reverse. Now, we have to be open to the possibility of shocks happening, as Professor Loungani was telling us about. I think we have to be conscious of potential downside risks. So I wanted to highlight some of the risks around that forecast and hopefully spur some conversation for later on. Now, in terms of our outlook for next year, what we think is likely to be the case is that we're going to have a consumer-driven recovery that will continue. So the consumers are really in the driver's seat in terms of the recovery for the world. In even clearer case, in the case of the US, we are continuing to see fairly strong growth in terms of consumer spending. I've put here some comparisons to look at consumer spending growth relative to the decade prior to the COVID crisis. And you can see here that we have growth expected to be about 30–40% higher at the global level than it was pre-pandemic. In the case of the US, we're expecting consumer spending growth to be about twice as high as it was during the pre-COVID years in 2022. So there's still fuel in the tank in terms of economic activity, but we're going to see this transition away from public sector driven growth where consumer spending was playing a big role, but thanks to a lot of fiscal aid, in particular in the US, to an environment where there's going to be less of that fiscal stimulus and more private sector driven activity. Now, I think one of the points that was made earlier is very well taken in terms of forecasting, because there are a number of dimensions that have really affected the way the economy has evolved. And I think here 4 factors are key in differentiating the speed at which different economies around the world have rebounded. I've put 3 of them as being health factors and 1 which is a policy factor, which I think is very important to understand when we're thinking about forecasting and big changes in terms of forecasts. The first one, of course, is the COVID restrictions. Countries around the world adopted very different types of restrictions, and that led and continues to lead to very different recovery paces across the world. At the same time, the speed and diffusion of vaccines has also been very different across the different economies of the world and has led to various speeds of recovery for the different economies around the world. The COVID tolerance is also something that's quite interesting because we've had a mix of countries. We've had some countries with high tolerance, some countries with low tolerance. In Asia, for instance, you have a mix that is somewhat constrictive in terms of economic activity of very low tolerance to COVID cases and vaccine diffusion, which is a little bit slower. Australia is a key example there where we've seen a slowdown, a reversal actually in economic activity because of that duo, which is impinging growth. And then the 4th factor, which I think is important to keep in mind, is policy drive. In the US, we had a very strong impulse that led to massive transfers to households, to businesses, to state and local governments, which essentially allowed for disposable income to remain above its pre-COVID level throughout the crisis and up until today. And that really buffered the shock, made the shock in the US much less significant than it was, but also has spurred a much stronger recovery in the US than in other countries. And when we were seeing charts earlier about the changes in the forecast, I think one of the key factors in the changes to the forecast around April and May was the CARES Act. Very few people actually expected the CARES Act to be passed or to be as big as it was and as rapid as it was. And that led to a big effect on most people's forecasts. So I think policy is another dimension that we have to keep in mind when we think about the forecasts. Now, the first risk I wanted to talk about, which has been highlighted by Professor Gold, is this idea that we have to have a solid and robust health recovery in order to sustain a robust economic recovery. That cannot be highlighted enough because that's really the key underlying driver of economic activity. We've had this 3rd global wave, this 4th wave in the US with the Delta variant leading to a surge in new infections and hospitalizations and unfortunately in death, and that has constrained economic activity. So that's the first factor that we have to keep in mind, and that should be the main factor that we analyze when we look at the economic outlook. And I wanted to highlight just how quickly and how rapidly things can turn around when we have these types of deteriorations in the health situation. Globally, we've seen some countries go into reverse and see a fallback in terms of economic activity. In the US, fortunately, we have not had that, but we did have the summer cut in half. If you recall, back in June and July, economic momentum was very strong. We were seeing that full rotation away from the durables goods sector towards more service sector activity. Leisure and hospitality were in high demand. People wanted to travel, take vacation. And then that started to slow very rapidly in August. And we essentially had a summer that was cut in half with a reversal in mobility, hotel demand, restaurant demand. All those factors were much less in demand, and that led to a cooling of economic activity, as you can see on this recovery tracker. Now, the second risk and the second factor behind this late summer slowdown is the fact that we continue to have supply issues. We continue to have supply constraints that are weighing on economic activity. And they take various different forms, but I think that's also a risk that we have to keep in mind in terms of looking at the outlook. We've seen material shortages, not just of semiconductors, but across a broad range of products, we've seen shortages and supply chains have been strained. You You can see here in Europe, you can see it in the US, where we've continued to see a steady rise in the backlog of orders. All those factors are constraining not just production, but also constraining demand, and that's very important to keep in mind. Now, one thing I would note, which is very encouraging, is that actually this steady rise in the backlog of orders is a good sign that despite the supply constraints, we still have strong demand that's leading to these backlogs. So that's an encouraging development. But these supply chain issues are affecting both production and demand, and that's very important to keep in mind. You're seeing essentially the result of higher inflation from this demand and supply mismatch that's being passed on to consumers through businesses too. And we're also at the same time seeing slower demand. One of the key factors that's restrained economic activity of late in the US is the fact that the inventory rebuild is much, much slower than we had expected. And that has led to some pretty significant downward revisions over the next few quarters in terms of expected growth, because we're seeing these supply constraints not just affecting production, but also affecting demand. And that's something to keep in mind. Now, it's not just about capital issues, it's also an issue of labor. We've seen labor supply constraints across most economies, if not all economies around the world. You can see here on the left-hand side the stress in terms of labor shortages in Europe. You can see it on the right here, where we've tried to build an indicator of labor market stress across different sectors, with the leisure and hospitality, manufacturing, education sectors all being quite severely constrained by these shortages, by these supply issues that range from the health issue, the health conditions, to issues that pertain to childcare. Unemployment benefits were perhaps a factor, early retirements, stock market developments. A number of factors can be called upon to highlight some of these labor supply constraints. But I think it's important to keep in mind that these are likely to stay with us for quite some time. And they've led to higher inflation, which has been another topic and another risk. I think we're likely to see inflation stickiness going forward. We're probably past peak inflation, but inflation is likely to stay with us for some time, hotter inflation than expected. Earlier on in the recovery, there were really two camps. There was the transitory camp, and there was the inflationary spiral camp. Well, I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle, probably with some stickiness of inflation going into 2022, with some factors continuing to be a source of inflation going into next year, and other factors being more of a restraint. We saw it last month, which was, I think, quite encouraging in terms of underlying dynamics, in that we saw some fallback in demand at the end of the summer for leisure activities, for hotels, for used cars, and that led to lower prices. So there hasn't really been an inflationary psychology that's settled in. If anything, inflation dynamics are still reacting quite healthily, and we're not in an environment where we're going to see this spiraling inflation. And I don't think we should even be talking about stagflation either, because what we're seeing is that when demand is weaker, we're actually seeing downward pressure on prices, notwithstanding the supply side issues, which will continue to put a lid in terms of how price levels change, but inflation is likely to continue to moderate going into next year. The other thing that's been quite reassuring, and we have to add a caveat here in terms of what they're worth in terms of inflation expectations, but the fact that they've not broken out of recent ranges, historical ranges, is also encouraging. We've seen essentially a rise in inflation expectations, but in the medium term, they've not broken out of recent ranges. So that's also another factor that I think is encouraging in terms of the inflationary dynamics. The fourth risk that we have to talk about is the risk in terms of fiscal policy. I think one of the key factors that I mentioned in my intro is that we're going to go from a fairly large impulse of fiscal stimulus around the world to one where we see much less fiscal impulse. One of the key facets of this recovery, and this is, I find, a great illustration of that, is the speed and the magnitude of the fiscal stimulus program that was put in place over the past 18 months. We had the equivalent of about 25% of GDP that was spent, or that was authorized by Congress, and that was passed on to businesses, to households, to state and local governments. I've compared that not just in terms of size, but also in terms of speed to what happened during the financial crisis. And there's simply no comparison. So the amount of fiscal stimulus, in particular in the US, was really the key factor that led to less significant shortfall in terms of economic activity and a more rapid rebound. But the fiscal impulse is going to be more negative. It was already negative actually this year, and it's likely to be more negative next year. And as we see this transition from the public sector to the private sector, we should be very attentive to how much growth slows. As I said, I think fundamentals for the private sector remain fairly healthy and should continue to support economic activity going into next year. But this transition is a very delicate one. And that transition occurs even with additional fiscal stimulus that Congress is currently debating, the $550 billion infrastructure plan and the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. We've put into our forecast, which is right there, $2.5 trillion of additional spending from the reconciliation bill and $550 billion from the infrastructure bill. Without those, you get an additional drag on economic activity next year, about 7/8 next year, and about 1.1 percentage points in 2023. So these are potential downside risks in terms of economic activity. And I'll conclude with this fifth risk, which I think is something that we should keep in mind, is the fact that despite the Fed having adopted a more dovish framework with the flexible average inflation targeting framework, there is a gradual shift, I think, towards a more hawkish monetary policy environment. It's not hawkish per se, but it's slightly more hawkish. I think the key lesson from the meeting last week, the FOMC meeting last week, and Fed Chair Powell's quite honest discussion or speech was that essentially he expects QE tapering to start in November, to run through the first half of next year. And what I found very interesting is that there was much less pushback against the fairly hawkish dot plot, which we know what it's worth, much less pushback against that than I would have expected. Because right now, what the dot plot is showing, these median rate hike expectations are showing rate liftoff in 2022 from 2023 in the prior meeting, and then 3 rate hikes in 2023, which is a fairly hawkish profile against which Powell didn't push back that much. So there is a possibility that we might see a bit more of a hawkish Fed going forward. We still have expectations at Oxford Economics of liftoff taking place in 2023 with 2 rate hikes. But as you can see here, the dot plot and markets are a little bit more hawkish in terms of their view. So just to conclude, I think there is still a lot of momentum in terms of economic activity. We have a fairly constructive outlook for next year. You can see here, this is a quarterly profile. We expect one of the key drivers will be the gradual rebound in the inventory rebuild. But as I said, there are downside risks in terms of the fiscal policy stance, which could curtail the recovery. And one of the key factors that we've observed is that actually we've become more optimistic about the long-term outlook. We used to think that there would be a 1.5% to 2% shortfall in terms of the long-term level of GDP relative to its pre-COVID path. We're now closer to 0.5, 0.7% lower. So we've halved the scarring from the crisis. And in part, that's been due to the policy response, which I think was much stronger than any of us anticipated in the face of the COVID crisis. So on that, I'll end and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. We'll start with the question for you, Jeff. So both you and Greg showed the COVID case chart with sort of wave upon wave of COVID. So, and of course, Greg described sort of the economic repercussions of these COVID waves. And so the question really is, where are we headed? Is it just going to keep going in terms of waves, or what are the projections for COVID and the pandemic, and what are you seeing could be a possible end or mitigation of what we're going through now?
Well, why don't I start, and I'd be interested what Greg thinks as well. Many of us thought, myself included, that by the time our kids went back to school this fall, this would have been in the rearview mirror. And clearly that is not the case. And so reflecting, the question is why? And there are several things that have happened. One was that, of course, we're dealing with multiple variants, and that is just the natural evolution of these viruses. They become far more transmissible, and therefore they spread more rapidly. And as they become more transmissible, they evade the human immune system, meaning people who were previously infected get reinfected. And unfortunately, they will evade our vaccines more or less over time. So with each iteration of another mutation, we run more and more risk. Another factor that needed to be considered is the rollout of the vaccines. We've learned a tremendous amount about how to manufacture and distribute affordable, high quality vaccines, but it's going to take some time to do that worldwide. And indeed, I think we significantly underestimated the vaccine hesitancy that certainly we've seen in this country and other parts of the world. And then finally, I would put it into a bucket of what I call human behavior. That is, I think people are just sick and tired of dealing with the pandemic, wearing masks, socially distancing, and doing all of the things that we know make a difference in the transmission of the virus. And so whether it's college football, where I live and work, or back to school, or whether it's large meetings, and globally, we're just seeing people behave in ways that we know are just going to add to the transition and the transmission rates. So, I guess to put it all together, we're going to continue to see this Delta wave spread across the United States and around the world. It is unquestionably the most transmissible by probably a factor of at least 1,000, and many would say 10,000. And we're going to see continued vaccine breakthrough and reinfection. And, hopefully, we will not see other variants compete with it. Thus far, the Lambda, the Mu, and the other variants have not successfully competed with it biologically. But, our epidemiologists and our virologists will tell you that is exactly a matter of time. So, all things in the best case scenario, I would say by the time Santa jumps down the chimney, much of this will be in the rearview mirror. I think the realist in me tells me that a year from now, we're still going to be dealing with this at some level.
Jeff, let me follow up on that just for a minute. You're saying it's going to be with us for a while longer, but certainly one thing that we're seeing changing is we're seeing clinician burnout. We're seeing health sector workers quit. We see the health sector with unprecedented labor shortages of nurses and doctors, and they're retiring or they're quitting or they're doing other things. And so how are we going to confront these future waves? Can you talk a little bit about the labor situation that we're seeing in the health sector?
Sure. So I have the honor of co-chairing the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine workforce group on clinician burnout. That's a euphemism for depression, retirement, suicide, et cetera. And we are seeing unprecedented rates of loss of the health professions workforce, not just in the United States, but certainly in the developed countries around the world, and I'm sure well beyond that. It is a very serious concern, and there's no simple solution to it, because it's not as simple as frequently in other sectors of the workforce to just put dollars and cents. There are individuals, many individuals who are looking at 5, 10, 15, 25, even 35% reductions in their frontline workforce, which not only, of course, affects the care of COVID patients, but it affects, every mom who's going to have her baby. It affects people that are having chest pain that need to be treated for heart attacks, strokes, just anything and everything in between. Cancer care, Alzheimer's, I mean, the whole show. It just produces tremendous backlogs into our emergency medical systems. And unfortunately, at least right now, there's no simple solution to it. What I'm hoping is that as we start to get beyond some of these ultra high surge stages of the pandemic, that people will regain their resiliency and be able and willing to come back to work. But that's a bit of a calculated risk.
Thank you so much for that. Greg, let me turn to you. I mean, you talked about your supply chain disruptions in some detail, and the permanent versus transitory nature of the impacts on inflation, for example, but you didn't talk so much about what's happening in the labor market. And I'm wondering, what are you seeing in terms of wages? How wages, are they rising, and how are they going to feed into inflation, and how is that going to affect the recovery?
Yeah, I think it's very important to keep in mind the labor dynamics, because we tend to focus on labor demand, but labor supply is really important. And I think it's important to understand why labor supply has been so constrained and the real underlying reasons. I think there are multiple factors. We tend to always want to pinpoint one factor as being the key factor that has restrained labor supply, but I think it's a combination of factors. I think one of the points that was made earlier is that this is not the last pandemic, and we're not going to return to a pre-COVID world anytime soon. There are a number of factors that make today's environment very different from what it was 18 months ago. And I think all of those labor supply constraints are weighing against the pace of growth of employment. And they vary. I mean, the first one is, of course, the health situation. As I said, I strongly believe that we're not going to get this robust economic recovery before we get a good handle on the health situation. So that's number one. Number two, I mean, you were talking about depression and issues of that sort on the healthcare front, but the childcare issue is also very important. We continue to see restraints in terms of childcare availability, affordability. All those issues are key because they make today's environment and the choice that you have to make between working and not working today, very different from what it was back in February of 2020. The unemployment benefits, I mean, there's this whole debate of whether unemployment benefits were restraining the labor supply or not. I think they were to some extent, but they were not, and certainly are not, the only factor restraining labor supply. You've seen it in terms of the most recent weeks of data. We've seen not a surge in terms of the labor market. And I think in this environment where we've seen a worsening of the health situation and a worsening of the economic situation, the end of the unemployment benefits may be more of a negative than a positive in terms of households. We can go on about early retirement. We can go on about what people were doing with their spare time in terms of making money on the stock market. Perhaps that was another factor that was restraining the labor supply for some people. So there are a number of factors that are all weighing on labor supply. And the other thing that I would note in terms of your question is that we've seen some positive momentum in terms of wages. The mismatch in urgency of finding jobs meant that we saw this healthy rise in wages for the lower income tranches of the population. And that's very good in terms of compensation, in terms of income growth, and eventually in terms of spending. I don't think we're going to see a price wage spiral that some fear. I think we're seeing a re-leveling of wages at the lower end of the income spectrum. And if anything, I think that's quite good because at the same time, we're seeing some encouraging developments on the productivity front, which allow businesses to not have to pay all of the cost of additional labor and additional capital costs.
Thanks, Greg. Let me turn to some of the audience questions. So Jeff, this one's for you. Dr. Gold, why are you confident that the differential outcomes in Japan and Korea were related to their policy response rather than to other factors such as climate or luck? How would their response work while mitigating even more severe economic damage? I might add to that comorbidities too, because I think we're probably not as healthy in this country as in South Korea and Japan.
So sure, there are any number of factors, but when you look at the classical public health pandemic response paradigms that relate to trained workforce, data and communication systems, just-in-time training, supply chain management, and facilities, those are the day-to-day things that sit up top of climate, of comorbidities, and so many other factors. And there are a number of lessons that have been learned from analyzing those factors directly and the ability. I mean, believe me, there is no secret sauce that could have averted the majority of where we are now. But the premise is that similar to other parts of the world that had perhaps a somewhat more mature approach to the systems development, we could have bought some time. And, you know, and I would be very remiss if I didn't take a minute to comment that the technology and the basic biological science around overall diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccine development, et cetera, not just for viruses, but for cancer, for heart disease, for Alzheimer's and stroke and so many other diseases, has been dramatically catapulted into the future. And so when we talk about economic development, I'm really optimistic that we're going to see some of these advances applied to a very broad spectrum of early diagnostics, home diagnostics, early intervention, better targeted so-called precision medicine, and in addition to that, a wide spectrum of treatment that currently doesn't exist. And so, you know, I think that's a cause for optimism, not only on the clinical side, but frankly, on the economic side as well.
Oh, that's great. A note of optimism. Did everybody hear that? That's great. We need that.
We need a little bit somewhere here and there, right?
Yes, thank you for that, Dr. Gold. Okay, Greg, back to you. How much would the infrastructure bill proposed by the Biden administration contribute to long-run GDP growth if it's passed?
Well, it depends on what is passed.
Yeah.
Because right now, Congress is, as you all know or have heard, Congress is dealing with a number of issues, 3 big issues. Actually, this week is going to be fascinating from a policy perspective. We have the need to pass funding for the government budget for next year. Barring that, we'll have a government shutdown on Friday. We have the need to raise or suspend the debt ceiling. That's probably around mid-October, but we're getting fairly close to that. And then there is this question of whether Democrats can agree on a package that includes the infrastructure bill and the budget reconciliation bill, which, by the way, includes some infrastructure spending. So if we're just looking at the infrastructure bill on its own, in terms of its long-term impact, it's not really a game changer in terms of lifting potential output, but it can make some difference, maybe a tenth, but I would say at most in terms of long-term growth. We're looking at a very different mix in terms of fiscal stimulus going forward. As I mentioned, the stimulus for the first 18 months of the crisis was essentially $5.5 trillion over a very short period of time, with almost immediate release of the funds, transfers, checks to people, unemployment benefits, a number of benefits that were awarded. Infrastructure spending is expected to be split over 10 years. So we're looking at $500 billion, but split over 10 years, which is about 50 billion per year, very different than 5 trillion over 18 months. So in terms of the lift to potential output, we're likely to see a fairly gradual lift in terms of the potential output for growth.
Well, since you raised it, I'm going to put you on the spot. So what happens to the economy if the government shuts down on Friday?
Well, it depends how long, whether it's a full shutdown or a partial shutdown. We calculate that, we estimate that essentially for every week of government shutdown, you get about a 10th drag on GDP growth. So it's not huge, but if you recall the 2018, late 2018, early 2019 government shutdown, we had a shutdown that was the longest in history, 35 days. So that's 4/10 off of growth. At the time, this was a partial shutdown. So we had about 400,000 workers that were put on furlough. We had another 400,000 that actually were asked to work without pay. So that lessened the blow in terms of economic activity, but it was still visible. About 4/10 when your economy is growing at a 2% pace is significant. The other impact is that you have a series of disruptions in terms of economic activity. For those of us that forecast, or for policymakers, you have a shutdown of data releases, which can lead to people flying blind. You have museums, you have national parks that are shut down, you have payments, IRS payments that are suspended. You have a number of factors that are generally suspended and that can hurt people, and generally can hurt people, especially at the lower end of the income spectrum. So there are a number of consequences beyond just the macroeconomic impact.
So Jeff, I mean, that question for you then, I mean, obviously the government is a big part of the response to the pandemic. I mean, it seems unthinkable that they would shut down the government in the middle of a pandemic, but what happens if in that case? Do you have a scenario, or are you deliberating over this?
Well, for sure, we of course have lived through the previous shutdowns. And for those of us that work in large academic medical centers, that has to do with everything from the delivery of clinical care to the ability of our students, particularly in the health professions, to continue their education through federal stipends and loans, to the support of research. We do hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of federally funded research for the National Institutes of Health, for the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and others in these exactly needed areas, vaccines, antivirals, predictive methodology, things of that nature. The thought of paralyzing that, I think at this time would be daunting. But, do we have contingency plans? Of course. It's not going to result in a shutdown of our institutions, but it'll certainly slow things considerably.
Thank you. All right, I got a bunch of questions. So the NABE members are waking up. All right, so a follow-up for you, Dr. Gold. So do you think the high percentage of underlying health conditions in this country have adversely impacted our case and subsequent death totals from COVID?
There is little question, Pia, that is true. We know from even the earliest Wuhan versions of the virus that advanced age, but medical comorbidities, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, tobacco use, asthma, and certainly other underlying conditions such as heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease, etc., all add to the risk of hospitalization, and all add to the risk of getting on a ventilator, and all add to the risk of death. In addition to that, we also know that whenever you stress the healthcare system and you look at the dependency on comorbidities, that traditionally underserved population, and whether these are African American, whether these are Hispanic or immigrant populations, whether these are, in many cases, are Native American populations. But in my state, which is quite rural, with huge populations of farmers and ranchers, even in the rural parts of the state, we see a lot of underserved population and a lot of comorbidity as well. And so that has a lot to do, frankly, with the supply chain of everything from protein production in the United States, where we do a good deal of it, to grain, to soybeans, corn, and other such things, which we are, of course, a major exporter of, but a good part of our nation depends upon that. So when, it may seem inconsequential that some of these microcosms of population are ravaged by COVID such that they can't work with high hospitalization rates, et cetera. But when we have to shut down meatpacking plants or can't bring harvest to market, that has dramatic implications across the country as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Greg, this question is for you. Do you think we may be witnessing the emergence of a new labor revolution? Will labor capture finally and more of the returns going forward, since capital has been capturing them for a long time?
I don't think I would be as optimistic as that in terms of what we're seeing. We've certainly seen some major shifts in terms of the labor market. I think some of these shifts are likely to stay with us. Some have been accelerated, but I'd be very cautious in saying that we're essentially going back to more of the income pie going to labor. One thing I would note, though, is that we've seen some interesting and encouraging developments in terms of productivity growth. One aspect of this crisis is that it has led to digitalization, it has led to roboticization, it has led to a number of improvements in terms of flexible work arrangements. It has also, for the time being, as I mentioned earlier, led to greater bargaining power by workers and is leading to a re-leveling, I think, of wages at the low end of the income spectrum. So the combination of those developments put together actually can put us on a stronger trajectory in terms of economic activity. And this is all tied together. I think it's important to keep in mind that if we are able to take the benefits from these developments, these technological developments, and put them to good use, then we can have both higher wages, which are offset by gains in productivity, and which make unit labor costs less expensive. So for businesses, that's still a positive. And it's also positive for households across the country. So both are possible at the same time.
That's great, Greg. Keep it coming. All that good news. Okay. So Dr. Gold, here's an interesting question about the future of the healthcare sector. I guess some of our mismanaged response to the pandemic has been an artifact of sort of our patchwork healthcare system in the United States. So the question is, do you think the healthcare sector in the US will move more in the direction of Europe and Japan with a greater role for the government?
Well, I think it'll be mixed, actually. I think that the deficiencies or the gaps as I see them, and I've been in the healthcare policy world for a very long time, maybe too long, are really around communications, around data sharing. Of course, we've touched on the issues of supply chain, et cetera. Around quality and safety and access regionally. I don't think we have as much challenge as we have had in terms of managing the supply chain, standardizing some of the messaging, and indeed having solid, reliable sources of information. We need data, in a sense, we need instruments to fly this plane. And when it's a patchwork of different sources of information, it becomes very difficult to talk about policy. It becomes even more difficult to deal with supply chain, workforce distribution, et cetera. So I think we're going to have a chance to revisit that and are actually on a national level looking quite carefully at that right now.
Thank you. Greg, back to the question of the fiscal stimulus. The question is, do you feel that part of the reason that we've done a good job responding to the pandemic, is that part of the fact we learned from the housing bubble crisis? Did that set us up for success in responding to the pandemic? And then what lessons are we learning this time around in terms of fiscal response?
Well, I'll take the last one first. I think what we've learned is that it's important to act early and act big. I think that was a key difference in the response that we had from Congress relative to prior responses. And that really is something that we should remember from this crisis, because if we can get money into the pockets of households, businesses, state and local governments as needed, then we can essentially prevent an even sharper shock. I think the combination of not just fiscal policy, but Fed policy, the combination of the two and the speed at which these two institutions reacted was really unprecedented and prevented an even sharper fallout from this crisis. Had we not had the Fed intervene as rapidly, we might have had a financial crisis on top of this health crisis. So I think that's really the key lesson to remember is go early and go big. And from a forecasting perspective, just to circle back to what was said earlier, we shouldn't be afraid to prove ourselves wrong in terms of our forecasts when we're doing these forecasts. I remember back in February of 2020, I was giving an Outlook conference for Oxford Economics, and I suggested that if there was one case in DC or New York or San Francisco, our growth forecast would go from 2 to 0. And everybody said that's not possible. I actually had remarks from some of our clients saying that I was excessively pessimistic. And I look back and I thought that was crazy to say that. You usually don't say that you're going to be revising your growth forecast by 2 percentage points. But 2 weeks later, we were cutting our growth forecast to -4%. And then 2 weeks after that, -8. We were some of the most pessimistic ones when the crisis hit. I think we have to be open to the possibility of being wrong. And that's valid from a policy perspective, because the more we think we're right, the more likely we're going to get it wrong. So that's also a key lesson from a policy perspective.
Thank you, Greg. Great. We just have 2 minutes left. I think I've worked off the questions. So let me just give 1 minute to you, Dr. Gold, to wrap it up and just some concluding remarks, and then I'll turn to you, Greg.
Yeah, so first of all, very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. I extend a warm welcome to all of you to the sovereign state of Nebraska anytime you wish to visit. I think if I would leave you with any message is that we still need to have a considerable amount of care in the rollout of vaccines across the world, which is going to be critically important to do, but also taking care of each other, our kids, etc. We do not fully understand what the long-term consequences of this viral pandemic are. And by that, I don't just mean the economic consequences, but I mean the so-called long-haul syndromes and other things. And until we better understand that, we're going to have to continue to monitor the situation very closely. Having said that, I'm quite optimistic that we're going to get through this. And the next time we come around to this, we're going to do a much better job.
Wonderful. Thank you. Greg?
Again, also, it's been a pleasure to be here in person. I think we see that virtual reality can work.
Yes.
This first hybrid version of a panel works really well. So, we continue to be amazed by what we can do under stress. So again, I have a lot of optimism in terms of the outlook, but I think as Professor Gold was sharing, we need to be attentive to the health situation. We need to make sure that we ensure a robust and sustainable health recovery to ensure a sustainable and robust economic recovery.
Thank you, Greg. Well, thank you, Beth. Join me in thanking Greg.
Hey, everybody out there. Good to see you. Good to see you in person. Thank you all for taking the efforts necessary to ensure this event. I can tell you as a member of the planning committee, it's been quite an adventure planning this event, and hard decisions were made. And as an organization, think it's important to forge ahead and manage what's manageable. And we have the tools at our disposal to do things like this now. And so we're doing it. By gosh. So here we all are. Again, thank you for making the extra efforts needed to show vaccination and take the masking steps necessary. We think it's worth it. We hope you will too. We've already had 2 really excellent panels. We are going to be concluding today. Our panel is titled The Future of Money and the Outlook for Digital Currencies. And when we were planning this panel, originally I was concerned by it being too crowded because when we were originally planning this panel, it looked like The Federal Reserve System and their partner at the Digital Currency Lab at MIT, we're going to be rolling out these big white papers ahead of the conference on the Fed's efforts to explore digital currencies and MIT's efforts to explore some of the technology and logistics involved in that. And they were going to be putting it out for public comment. And that hasn't happened. And so they've been quiet. So we actually, that gives us a little bit more freedom to opine on what we think they can and should do today. I'm very honored to be joined by Carmelle Cadet, who is an entrepreneur in this area, founder, CEO of EMTech. She'll be telling us more about what she does and how she got here in a moment. And I'm just gonna briefly outline, we're at an incredibly rapid transition period for digital currencies. And what we're gonna focus on in our talk today is the public money aspect of it. The digital currencies from the perspective of central banks, what they're doing, what they're looking at, why, what are the challenges, what are the costs, what are the benefits. So that'll be our focus in contrast to cryptocurrencies as an asset class. And that's more of a sort of separate animal. Both of them are under intense regulatory scrutiny at the moment. The two infrastructure bills that are being negotiated in Washington incorporate various tax provisions oriented at capturing the capital gains and transactions in crypto currencies and crypto assets that are currently not explicitly treated like other assets for tax purposes. So there's an effort to tax them the same way other assets are taxed when there are capital gains and transactions that are realized. So that's probably going to make whatever gets passed, there will be some form of this in the final bills. And then there's another front of regulation that's really quite active at the moment at the Treasury Department and the other FSOC agencies. So the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which includes the SEC and the Federal Reserve and the Comptroller of the Currency. So they're actively engaged in reviewing stable coins in particular, stable coins being the digital currencies that link themselves explicitly to the value of the dollar or to the value of a basket of currencies. That has special concern for the governments that are backing with full faith and credit those currencies. So there's a very active agenda. We think that that is probably one of the reasons why some of these white papers from the Fed and their partners at MIT may have been delayed. And Chair Powell was asked about this at his press conference last week. And he did cite that their own exploration, he framed their own exploration of whether to engage in a digital currency or to issue a digital currency against the backdrop of what he, a proliferation of unregulated stable coins, and that might be a motivation for them to move forward with their own. So without further ado, I'm going to sit down and engage with a conversation with Carmelle. We are going to shorten the session to 45 minutes. So get your questions ready. I'm sure you have lots of them. And we have good expertise up here to handle it. So I'm going to now move to the comfy chairs. So thank you again, Carmelle, for joining us today. I just wanted to start for the benefits of the people in the audience. Can you tell us a little bit about, give us the whirlwind tour of your journey? How did you get here? Where did you start? And what are you doing right now?
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me. The conversation today is something that I am very passionate about. I am originally from Haiti, and I think everyone just about everyone knows Haiti these days, given the challenges, and we'll talk more about that. But I migrated to the US as a political refugee and had the opportunity to go to college and got a ticket to IBM. So I spent 10 years, built a career in enterprise IT, corporate finance, global treasury, and looked at how to deploy enterprise technology around the world. Coming from Haiti, the importance of financial inclusion was always something that I wanted to go back to and try to fix. And it is a bigger problem around the world, but also in the US. And I think that's something that a few of us discovered and saw more brightly during the stimulus package and the pandemic. It's unfortunate that it took such an event to make that clear, but the fact of the matter is, I think the search for new solutions, for new rails, led us to a conversation and topic today to talk about how technology can solve challenges, legacy challenges, chronic challenges, sometimes due to lack of physical infrastructure. But now with digital infrastructure, and I was listening to the previous panel, the breakthrough in healthcare that has happened over the past year due to COVID, there is an emerging breakthrough happening in money.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what excited me. I fell in love with the concept of blockchain. So I joined the IBM blockchain team. Thank you. The IBM blockchain team when they were starting the division, and started working on stable coins. And that was around 2018. Just defining like, what would a stable coin be?
Right.
If we could do a stable coin, because we saw the rise of crypto.
Right.
I remember I was maternity leave, binge watching on what is Bitcoin and learning more about it. So by the time I came back, we were looking at really interesting use cases around the use of blockchain. Food traceability is a very important one. For example, if you think about the outbreaks that happen for food and spinach or any other food condiments that we rely on, sometimes it takes 2 weeks for a company to shut down the whole production line, the whole supply chain to find out where it's coming from. And blockchain was proving out to be a really interesting technology to provide from 7 days to 5 seconds visibility into a traceability for a particular item.
Wow.
So I really fell in love with the technology. Understanding that and how I could break that and how I could bring that into financial services. For me, the concept of providing access to finance to someone, regardless of where they're from, regardless of how much money they make, they need access to digital finance because the world is moving digital. So for me, the lack or the lower dependency on intermediaries that blockchain can provide, and we'll talk more about the Fed's research too on this, on programmable money and how we can provide new capabilities.
Right.
So I left IBM, launched EMTech. I fell in love with the idea of also going to the core of the financial infrastructure, which is central bank currency.
Yes.
Money is created by central banks. I'm sure there's another world at some point that people imagine with decentralized or crypto, monetary policy. But in solving for a very specific problem for me, there are so many use cases that digitizing central bank money can bring a lot of benefits.
So you're focused on that channel of delivering the efficiencies, the lower costs, the less intensive infrastructure requirements through central banks. So tell us a little bit about who you work with and what have you learned from those engagements?
Sure. So when I launched EMTech, we had the first opportunity to work with the first central bank that launched a live central bank digital currency, which is the Central Bank of Bahamas. And then as we looked around the world, we saw Africa as the Caribbean as potential amazing markets to really help leapfrog on a technology that could not only provide a reform structurally, kind of institutional reform, and that could impact broadly, kind of countrywide. How do people engage with money, access money, and use money? And as we talk to central banks, and I started EMTech with the idea of really trying to figure out what can we do with central bank tech. And everyone, told us, you're crazy. I mean, central banks don't buy technology and they don't innovate and they don't do technology. But as we went to talk, Bitcoin was coming out, Libra was coming out.
Right.
Certain things were happening, the timing of it. China rolled out theirs as well. So there have been
Right.
some milestones along the way.
That have really accelerated.
A lot. And along the way, we discovered that digital currency itself was not the only major innovation that was happening at central banks right now, is that they were on a path of digitization. They were on a path of innovation. And I think as COVID came along, the financial infrastructure, the money infrastructure around the world, everyone realized needed
Needs a
an
reboot.
uplift.
Needs some
An
investment.
uplift.
Needs some investment.
That's right. So that's what we do. EMTech is building modern technology for central bank. We love the idea of modern central banking, building central banking infrastructure with API-led models, which is a way to really share data more efficiently, more bit safely. And when you think about blockchain, cash today, that central bank money, as you were referring to, the importance of the role of central bank money in the economy, the dependence of it is critical. The innovation around it is critical. And pick a country and you'll have different priorities.
Right.
I know for the US, geopolitical aspect is a big thing as far as China introducing theirs, but there are amazing use cases domestically as well for why they should consider it.
Right. And so can you give us a flavor for the Bahamas, which was an early adopter? What have you seen in terms of the benefits? What have been some of the challenges or setbacks in terms of implementation?
Sure. I think one of the greatest examples and lessons that I take through my engagement with the team and with the central bank is that it takes leadership. And also it takes a problem to solve. Pick a problem to solve, not doing it for the sake of doing it, because it can get pretty complicated.
Right.
And if you don't have an anchor on why you're doing it, it can get pretty out of hand. But the central bank governor had a pretty good focus on financial inclusion, the need to provide access to finance, given the limitation of the banking sector as well. Was something that I think was admirable.
So it really was about sort of distributing the benefits of digital currency to a population that was underserved by the banking system.
And I remember watching him doing a press conference during the pilot saying, if you hold paper cash in your hand, you should be able to have digital currency. That simple. So then you get into KYC and AML and so on. But true inclusion requires adjusting to people's circumstances.
Right.
Some countries don't have driver's licenses, and even our driver's license, I wish we had an API that someone could renew my driver's license for me and I could do it via my app. It's not as modern.
Right.
It still has a lot of friction
Right.
to go through, and some countries don't have them at all. So how do you meet international standards when you don't have a reliable government ID system?
Right. Yeah. Because Bahamas. So one of the debates and the discussions in CBDC, central bank digital currency, is whether to have it be account based, so that you know your customer, you establish an identity, you set up an account for an individual, versus a more anonymous blockchain. And I believe the Bahamas did a little bit of both. Is that correct?
The truth of the matter is, it's the model that ends up executed has to work for the problem that you're trying to solve.
Right.
If you're trying to solve for financial inclusion and you want the merchant or you want the grandmother, that's the only thing that they have is the cash that they have under their mattress, and you want to make them trust you to keep it in a digital wallet, you probably want to think about that. If that person passes away, what does inheritance look like if you have digital cash in a wallet? So therefore, you cannot go fully token based, where it's pseudo-anonymized or that.
Right, like cash,
Right, that's
as
true.
anonymous as cash.
Correct. The difference is that in cash, you have a physical aspect to it that if you leave
Right.
it somewhere, someone can come and find it.
Right,
But in a digital wallet, if you don't have the password, if you don't have access to it.
right,
So an account-based system makes more sense to some level to
Right.
allow the traceability and the ownership tracking
Right.
if for nothing else. But then when you start thinking about that cash should be ubiquitous and being able to take it to any transaction. If you think about it, it just goes in with your paper or bank deposit, and then it enters different verticals and different transactions. And making that digital currency available in different forms and different channels also will reflect the need, whether you can be pseudo-anonymous if it's a peer-to-peer network and only the person that you're transacting to needs to know, or if you have an account-based system that requires you to do some KYC.
and were there any particular sort of technical challenges, or was there the issue of privacy a big concern in the countries you've worked with?
That's across the board. Every central bank we've talked to has brought that up. And us, as we look at building central bank stack, central bank infrastructure, is a big priority for us. And we've been talking about CBDC for quite a while. EMTech is 2 years old now, but we want to get it right. We're still in beta. We're working with some key companies. We have some announcement coming up as far as the R&D work that we're going into.
Okay.
There are different technologies out there. We've looked at all of them. We think there are still gaps to be filled for the purpose of
Protecting customer
privacy and performance,
Mm,
right? If you want to have a digital cash infrastructure, it has to be fast. It has to be real time
Yeah.
at scale. That takes time.
right.
And being able to do that in a trusted manner. There are technologies that Ethereum, we haven't talked about the protocols yet, but people build on Bitcoin, people build on Ethereum. There are other technologies. We're looking at Hashgraph and see how that can improve certain aspects of the performance.
Right.
So we're really excited at this stage to really hopefully talk to the Fed too. We've been talking to a few Federal Reserve banks around the world on what a digital cash infrastructure should look like, and the US needs one.
Yes, yes, it does. And so let's bring it to the US context a little bit, because of course, the United States has a very different set of concerns and considerations in terms of its cost benefit analysis, because it is the reserve currency of the world. And you often hear Chair Powell sort of express some anxiety about, you don't want to make a mistake. You don't want to rush into something and get it wrong when you're the reserve currency of the world. He also, it's interesting that you say you need to have a very clear idea of your goal. One of the things that that has been kind of thrown out to my mind, is a bit of reluctance from the Fed in terms of embracing CBDC is like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? We have a system that covers 90% of the population. They've already committed to a real-time payment infrastructure. So is that enough? Is that, do they need to go further, or is just meeting the challenge presented by stablecoins motivation enough? So what do you think in terms of the US context? What is the greatest gain to be had from a digital currency?
Well, I think if you're the Fed, your motivations would be different from a private company issuing a stable coin, right?
Yes.
You have a mandate, and I think Chair Powell mentioned that there was his press conference, is that the Fed is responsible for ensuring an efficient payment system for everyone.
Right.
For everyone.
For everyone, yes.
Not just for the banked.
Correct.
And access to digital financial services and efficient financial services is really a big gap in the US.
Yeah. So inclusion is also one of the main benefits that you could see coming from a digital
I think
currency.
it's an underrated use case for the US.
Right.
Because when you think about China, if you look at China as the main motivator, which has been the primary use case, one thing that they've done is get financial inclusion. whether you hate it or love it.
Right, right.
The idea is that they have full digital inclusion. When it comes to monetary policy, there's still a gap on how effective it can be if you can't reach everyone. And
Right.
if the population that you can reach is only to the banking system, you also see a concentration risk.
Right.
The fact that everything has to run through the banking system. So some of the opportunities, it's not inclusion just for the sake of inclusion. I know sometimes it doesn't excite people as much as it excites me, but it's the idea of having an inclusive ecosystem.
Right.
And what you're seeing right now, the emergence of stable coins, and which are offering different business model for financial services, are very interesting, and they're solving really key problems.
Right.
So how do you think about inclusion? One, at the access layer on who has access to central bank money.
Right.
There's a case to be made that it lowers potential risk to expand the access to fintechs or stablecoin issuers and so on, but also ensuring that anyone in the US who wants a digital cash wallet could access one, whether to receive benefits, whether to receive stimulus instead of printing checks.
Right.
The checks,
Yes.
the many checks.
Well, the checks, and they did a lot of electronic payments, and it worked sort of surprisingly quickly. But there was a lot of people that, because they didn't file,
That's right.
they didn't get it in time. So it was almost, again, the people that probably needed it the most quickly were the least likely to get
find it
quickly.
fast.
Yes.
Exactly. No, but I think one thing to mention is that those solutions are quick fixes.
Mhm.
They're short term, they are one time. Yes, they are set up a website for someone who did not get a check to go and provide their information, but you had to have a bank account,
You had to have a bank account.
or you get a check mailed.
Right.
And once you get the check, you have to wait for the bank to open up to go cash it.
Right. And then you have to wait for it to clear, and then you probably have to pay some
That's right.
fees on top of
And
that.
if you don't have a bank account at that bank, you probably can't cash it, or you pay a fee for that. It's very expensive and cumbersome.
Right.
I mean, the infrastructure of it all is very cumbersome.
Whereas would you agree then that one of the key propositions of the digital currency is just lowering the cost?
Lowering the cost and increasing access to everyone.
Right.
And if you want to improve a typical household's P&L.
Right.
Right.
P&L, I like that, typical. So, with regard to the sort of comparison with China, of course, the big thing that China actually doesn't want that the US does is privacy.
Yeah.
So
privacy is very important. I doing my testimony to the Financial Services Committee, I think it was in June, I mentioned that as well. I think we live in a very advanced age. By the time this comes out, if privacy mechanisms are not in place, a lot of people are not going to trust it, and it's going to be very clear and apparent that it's not. Just like we can tell that China's approach is very different, and whether you take it, yes, we want to do this, or no, we don't want to do this.
Right.
It's pretty clear and it's apparent, and people will react to that.
Right.
So I think privacy has to be a major consideration in implementing or developing something like that. But I'm also a big believer as part of the regulatory approach and the regulatory conversation that's happening right now. The opportunity to set the goals first and then drive to that, I think it's probably a different approach. Instead of fear,
right,
instead of trying to
just reacting to the fire that's been lit under you by all of this proliferation of scary.
Right. I mean, granted, crypto is now what, a $2 trillion market. Stable coins are growing from, I think the last numbers I saw last year, 11 million to over 100 million this year.
Right.
About 10% of the U.S. economy, 10 to 15% of the U.S. economy is now getting in crypto.
Right.
So it's getting serious.
It's getting, we might even call it systemic.
Yeah, that's right.
It's becoming systemic.
And at the very least, you understand the need for regulation, but the importance is, what are we trying to achieve?
Yeah.
Right. What are the problems that we want to fix? This technology is amazing. It's scary. It breaks the old models.
Yes.
It reorganizes the ecosystem.
Yes.
it
And
realigns.
that's actually part of the other sort of contrast with China is one of the pushbacks. Anytime you come in disrupting something, the people that hold the power now don't like that. So one of the pushbacks to a digital currency, especially a central bank digital currency, is that it would disintermediate the banking systems to some greater or lesser degree.
I can see the case. I hear that a lot.
Yes.
I can see the case, and I know a lot of papers have highlighted that before. But one of the key metric that at least we at EMTech kind of settle down on what could trigger that or control that is whether the CBDC is interest bearing. If it's a retail CBDC,
Right.
then you can say cash is not interest bearing. That's the job of a bank. If you want to earn interest on your money,
Right.
you'll find a counterparty to do that. Now, the question is that only through the bank?
Right.
Yes, today, if you want a CD, you go to a bank.
Right.
Today, if you go to a mutual fund, you go to a bank. Tomorrow, you might not go to a bank.
Right.
Or a bank might become a fintech.
Right. Right.
Right, because in the focus on technology to provide access to finance. As we talk about the future of money, I think that particular use case is an example of where things are really changing. There are certain things that you only had a banking system to go do it because you needed a trusted intermediary, you had high regulation, and you needed people to put the policies and controls in place. The Fed's paper, granted, I don't think it was a formal Fed paper, it was Alexander Lee from the Federal Reserve Board who put an opinion paper out on what is programmable money and the concept of coherent guarantee to be able to say, because you're going into a digital form, you have a technology that can enable you to very targetedly do something. If you want to put money out to provide agriculture or to provide clean energy, to provide certain mechanisms, around the world, people are trying to bring more women into the economy. You can actually do that in a targeted way. And with trust, with transparency, with less intermediaries.
Right.
Because you have smart contracts, you have rules that are very clear, but you still need the legal, you still need the regulatory bodies, or at least a framework to say, what is consumer protection in this new world?
Right. Right.
Right?
Right.
How
right.
do you,
Right.
you know,
What
make
is
sure
the
that
safety and oversight of the reserves backing the stable coins?
absolutely your
Right.
collateral management model,
Right.
your exchange model,
Right. To ensure that they talk to each other, to ensure competition rather than what we all deal with Google and Apple right now.
That's right. That's right. And that interoperability can happen. Imagine that interoperability happening at the lowest level of the infrastructure.
Right.
Right, where everyone has a mean to provide and to transfer money to one another, regardless of if you have a bank account at Bank of America, Chase. I know we have Zelle and Venmo and everything else.
Right.
And sometimes my Zelle takes 3 days to clear.
Right, because it's sitting on a bank deposit, right?
That's right.
Right, right, right.
Or you know, Cash App trying to figure out some of the examples. But you also hear complaints even from a Coinbase perspective, as far as consumers not having a call center to call. And so you need guardrails somewhere, right? And I think there are a lot of players who are willing to engage. It's a very fascinating conversation, it's exciting, but we have to be careful. But I think there are a few people who are at the table who are willing to take those things very seriously.
So do you see the future, you know, for the US as a sort of system of regulated stablecoin issuers, or a system of, or do you see the Fed taking it on in a more centralized way?
I think there's a happy marriage. So I think the Fed and Governor Breyer will be here tomorrow.
Yes.
I think even as a catalyst for innovation, or infrastructure provider or operator of a payment system, the central bank, in the case of the Federal Reserve, has limitations on what it can do. It doesn't have the mandate to do everything. And so this two-tier model that we've grown accustomed to, as far as the banking system providing the consumer-facing relationship of money, I think will continue, is just the makeup of that ecosystem.
Right.
But also the central bank has a direct relationship with people today in paper cash.
Yeah.
People don't particularly realize that. I realize over time is that when you hold paper cash in your hand, you have a relationship with the Fed, not with Bank of America or anyone else.
Right.
And when you have a bank deposit, your counterparty is the bank. But when you have paper cash, it's directly with the central bank. And I think those two models will continue to exist because central bank money is important to be directly in the economy, having access to people directly instead of only through the banking system.
Right.
I think it's something in the benefit of the central bank, but at the same time, they're limited on what they can do on consumer products.
Right.
So they need the private sector as well.
Right.
So there is, I think there will
A long history of a two-tier system where.
two-tier systems, but I think the broadening of that ecosystem is what is valuable now in thinking about the new regulation. But also the US policies impact the world.
Yes.
They do. And when we think about just emerging countries right now dealing with the difficulties of payment. So my home country in Haiti, and I know we're hearing a lot right now about what's going on the border, but people are leaving because it's really difficult to have a life.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful country. I don't know who has been to Haiti, but usually, exactly, usually there's always someone in the audience. But it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that most Haitian would love to stay in their country.
Right.
Not particularly migrate, but the need for innovative infrastructure.
Right.
When
so that people can just engage in commerce and
digital money. And today you don't have to be in an office to make money, right? You can be a freelancer, you can be a contractor. But if I want to hire a graphic designer in Haiti today, I can't pay them.
Right, right.
I literally can't pay them. They'd be happy to take US dollars. They'd be happy to.
Yeah, of course, of course. And they might, yes, it would be the globalization. I mean, that's one of the things we talk about coming out of the COVID crisis, actually, is some of the further globalization of service providers.
That's right. That's right.
And digital currency would certainly.
If you are the currency of the world.
Yeah.
Right? You kind of have to take that into consideration. So, some use cases that we play around with is how do you do stimulus packages? Yes, here, government benefit, but looking at the Central Bank of Haiti, they're looking at their digital currency because how can that help transform how people can get paid and really make a living where they are instead of having to migrate somewhere else.
Right.
Right.
So, and then there's a couple of questions here along that sort of global picture. So in some ways, emerging countries, small emerging countries are well positioned to kind of innovate now.
Absolutely.
And that could create a more diverse network between countries if they can talk to each other and exchange. And so, and then of course, China's already kind of moving ahead with theirs. So there's, questions both, will the emerging markets, will this be something that sort of facilitates further sort of growth and transformation, number one, and number two, what does all of this mean for the reserve currency status of the dollar? Does it further strengthen it if the US gets this right and moves ahead and if solves some of the interoperability issues globally? Or does this point us to a world where it's just further disintermediated or decentralized?
So the fact of the matter is the technology by itself will not solve all the problems. And one of the benefits that the US dollar ends up serving in the world is the trust. And honestly, the trade flows.
Right.
And that's why some parts of the world are very open to looking at the digital yuan because they import and they have very high trade flows with China. It's really a business decision.
Right.
To find a way to settle your trades.
Right.
So I understand why the competition with China is important because I think that's probably where you'll see where that trend falls.
Right.
But as I talk to multiple central banks, it is also about sovereignty.
Right.
For each country.
Right.
But it's not easy if you don't have the governance and the economics and the MacroPolicy and the regulation and the governance to go around it. It takes a lot to make the technology.
It can just be a new technology, but just as unstable and subject to runs
Correct. And
on the
people call me
currency.
about El Salvador. It's like, how do you think about El Salvador?
Yeah, so how do
Given
you
that-
think about El Salvador? Tell us how you think about El Salvador.
Well, I think if you're a country where your currency is less stable than Bitcoin, Bitcoin seems appealing.
Right. And that's saying something.
It
If
is
you're
saying
less
something.
stable than
Exactly.
Bitcoin.
Exactly. And some
Right.
currencies are more volatile than Bitcoin.
Yeah,
So sometimes you're actually getting to a more stable economy by moving to Bitcoin.
that's pretty
But
wild.
whether that is the right decision for them, I think we'll see over time. But I can understand the inclination
Right.
when lacking so many other pillars that would be important for something to work.
Right.
Your best alternative might be something else. But there are risks in doing that. There are opportunities clearly. But as we work with central banks, we help to foster that regulatory innovation framework that can really help them be part of the ecosystem to further guardrails that protect people. It's people's money, it's people hard-earned money that we're talking about
Right,
here.
right.
Right. So we really need to protect it. I want to feel comfortable telling my mom to buy, stable coins or crypto or CBDCs, right?
Right,
So for me, that's
right.
how I think about it
Doesn't meet the mom test.
all the time.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And what do you say, that one of the concerns with something like some of the blockchain technologies, that certainly with Bitcoin, the mining and the energy use and some of the, environmental ramifications of that.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more focus on that.
Yeah.
The concept of ESG is something that even our internal team has kind of brought to our attention. Thanks, Diane. I know she's watching. But the concept of governance around ESG is something we're actually looking at on how to help central banks implement ESG principles on their
To balance
design.
that concern.
Yeah,
Yeah.
on their design, on their governance and the framework that they are going to roll out. But you are seeing some, just like for solar energy,
Right.
at the beginning, you have some very expensive cost factors. It's innovation, it's kind of the beginning of the curve, and you'll see the factors kind of play into that. And you're already
I
seeing
see.
that in a way.
I see. So,
But-
so you're saying that you're optimistic that with more use comes more innovation, comes over time, reduced energy input to
That's
achieve
right.
the same
The
objective.
markets will create those type of the value that it can create. If there is a use, if there's a use case, if there's benefit to be driven, I think you'll have the market. But also there are other technologies out there that have different approaches to mining and no mining at all. That's why I mentioned we're looking at different technologies like Hashgraph as far as how do you provide tokenization without mining.
Right, right.
So we'll see.
And the answer is we don't know yet.
We'll hear more.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. I'm going to take us back to the mom test.
Okay.
Okay, so
Hi, Mom.
let's say for the average mom or dad on the street, what is this like? Why do they care? What benefit does this bring them in the US and maybe outside the US?
Sure. So if you are in the US and you are a typical mom making minimum wage and you're a single mom raising kids, you either depend on a paycheck. And if you are making just a little bit, sometimes you have negative balances. And if you want to have your check and if you don't have a bank account, sometimes they close your bank account because you can't keep up. So there are difficulties in the ecosystem as far as middle and low income families that probably not visible if you are someone who's making a good income and you get direct deposit every time.
Right.
And you have your 401k and everything kind of balanced out.
Right.
But for someone like that, there's a reason why check cashing stores are big business in the US.
Right.
Right.
And they
That-
make a lot of money
make a
by
lot of
charging
money.
you high fees.
And going to stand in line, and it's very physical. I would say that as an example. This is the proxy of the problem. I don't want to pick a group, but it's not the point of this. I don't want to pick a group of company to kind of make them the poster child. But the idea is if you have a need for someone needing to give you 20% of their paychecks in order for them to get money faster, there is a better way to doing it.
Right.
And that's what the world of either crypto or stable coins
Uh-huh.
is creating new markets on how can you either, if you have stable coins and you're not using them, can you lend it out at a much lower cost and within 30 seconds to someone who's looking for it?
Right.
Instead of them having to go give 20% of their paycheck. So some
Right.
new economics are emerging, but also the US is a melting pot.
Mhm.
A lot of people in the US building a new life, but sending money back home,
Mhm.
or money,
Mhm.
or people sending money in the US to pay for schools.
Mhm.
There are a lot of bilateral trade, and as we move in more global economy,
Mhm.
remittances,
They could get there
cross-border
faster,
payments,
cheaper.
much faster,
Yeah.
much faster. I mean, in some markets now, I have, we've hired, we hire around the world. So we're a team of 26. So we hire around the world. And I have a personal experience of what it's like to pay someone in the US versus outside.
Right.
It's a very different flow for me. I have to go to the bank in person to do it.
Right.
And it's very expensive. I'm still asking for, 1 month free and they won't give it to me. But the cost of it is very expensive.
Right.
And I can do it on my phone within 30 seconds
Right. Right.
versus leaving my office, going to the bank, getting in
Which
line.
would be a bigger benefit for people who are closer to that, living more, paycheck to paycheck.
Absolutely. I mean, the liquidity, we could go on forever, but the concept of fast transaction, think about the liquidity that you can create in the economy.
Right. Right.
The check that you wrote, that you deposit in the bank and it doesn't clear for next 3 days, there's kind of like that 3-day period of it that sometimes it's a float, but sometimes it's literally the communication system and the ledgering updating.
Right. Right.
It doesn't have to be that
We
way.
can do better.
We can do better. That's
All
it.
right. Well, thank you very much. One, let me just say it's an inspiration to have another entrepreneur. Best
Congratulations
of luck.
to you too.
Yeah, best of luck fighting the good fight out there.
Thank you. You too.
And please join me in thanking Ms. Cadet.
Thank you.
And we'll watch for the Fed paper and the, right, Dave, when's that coming out? Oh. So even as the Fed takes its time, entrepreneurs are out here doing their thing.
I mean, I think it's a great time for them. I know we haven't had time to talk about that, but that innovation that's happening here, it's a great opportunity for the Fed to think about sandboxes and bringing people like you, bringing people around the ecosystem at the table to really take a look at different use cases before putting a brush across everything, because there are different ways of doing stable coins. There are different problems to solve, and not overtaxing and undertaxing, I think would benefit from
Getting that balance
sandboxing,
right.
innovation, and so on. So
Wonderful.
thank you so much.
I'm all in. Thank you so much. So Tom, we have
Reception is
a
starting
reception?
shortly, so right down the
shortly-
hall, as soon as you get there, actually, Julia, as soon as Julia gets there, the reception starts, so down the hall to the left.
We
So.
have a reception, so we can actually talk to each other. Isn't that exciting? Not on a screen.